Dialogue Options and Perfecting Endings. Written by Aloha Flower. Read by Hijinks Audio. Chapter 3. System Assessment. Summary. Having discovered the quirk behind the time loops, Aizawa strategizes in how he might escape, but comes across several key difficulties. Quirk. Victory loop. Warning. Time-based. Warning. Hazardous. Category. Emitter. Touch-based. Description. When this quirk is activated, it forces the affected person to relive the same day over and over again until they fix what they believe to be that day's greatest failure. If no memorable or important failure was had on the day the quirk was used, the quirk will fail to activate. Extra considerations. Because this quirk hasn't been activated very many times, information about this quirk is limited. If you have been affected by this quirk, please contact the Quirk Accident Office at 564 XXXXXXX. This explained everything, and he knew what his greatest failure of the day was, the USJ. Or, more specifically, I let villains hurt my students and co-workers. He didn't really mind that the villains had hurt him. It was a bit disappointing that they had managed to injure him, sure, but it was nothing compared to the sting of hearing that teachers and students had been hurt. So now that he knew the cause of the loops, he needed to know how to fix them. He clicked into the additional details part of the quirk. It was a mess of semi-useful information, seemingly a quirk doctor's shorthand notes. Injuries will begin to vanish/heal over time between loops. No scars? Seemingly no aging. Refer to Case 2, longest time loop to date, lasting 192 iterations. Clothes/items do not travel with the person. Is it the body specifically? New earrings/piercings/tattoos put on during the loop appear to either A. not travel or B. leave a mark on the skin that disappears over time like injuries. The failure must be corrected/fixed specifically, not avoided. See Case 3, baseball game. Theory. Keep event as close as possible to initial setup for higher odds of success in escaping the loop. See Case 3, baseball game. Aizawa's eyes raked over the criteria. The failure must be corrected/fixed specifically, not avoided, it read, and if UA students and teachers getting hurt was his failure. He scowled. That meant he had to get through the USJ attack without anyone getting injured, except perhaps himself. If he was supposed to keep the event as close to the original as possible, preventing the USJ attack altogether wouldn't be an option. In Case 3, the basis for that recommendation, a baseball coach was affected, and his greatest failure was his team repeatedly losing. When he cancelled the game or switched out his entire team for competent players, the loop still reset. When he only switched out a few of his players and then changed to having better strategy, the team had won. That's oddly similar to the USJ in structure, Aizawa considered. The participants were fighters, not baseball players, but still. If Aizawa and the baseball coach's loops were similar, that meant Aizawa could switch out some of the people who were planning to come to the USJ, but switching out too many would fail to break the loop. Well, at least he had a goal now. Survive the USJ attack with no casualties, while keeping the initial structure of the encounter the same. Easier said than done, and already Aizawa's mind was whirring with potential strategies for surviving the villain encounter. There was something else odd that Aizawa noticed about the quirk though. There was nothing on the whole page or in the notes that said telling someone about the quirk would send him back. In fact, rather the opposite. In some of the cases, it seemed implied that the affected person told someone they cared about and got advice. How strange. Maybe it was a new facet of the kid's quirk? As kids grew, their quirks often took on new qualities or even mutated over time. To test whether or not the loop would reset, Aizawa dialed the number for the Quirk Accident Office. Hello, my name's Sherry. How can I help?
I'm calling to report a quirk accident,
Aizawa said. Oh dear, the person on the other end responded. Do you need emergency services?
No, just a consultation,
Aizawa said.
The person who did it was named Miura Hikaru.
I'm pulling up their file now, she said. Then she made a noise of slight surprise. Oh, I've never worked with a quirk related to time trap. The world cut out. When Aizawa got out of bed the next loop, he checked his phone out of habit and it was still Wednesday. He felt a lot better. His back was, at worst, slightly tender, and all his other injuries were completely healed. A good start. So, it looked like telling someone again caused the loop to reset. First Nezu, then the boy's mother, then the caller at the QAO. Aizawa wasn't sure why that was specific to him, but he supposed it might just be a new development with the kid's quirk. At least now he knew what he needed to do now. He needed to get through the USJ event in a way that left none of his students or co-workers injured, without preventing the incident and without changing too many major players. That seemed like something of a tall order, especially considering the massive scale of the villain attack. But he could probably do it. Just one extra teacher would be a world of help when it came to fighting the relatively unskilled yet numerous low-level quirks. So, all he needed to do was figure out how to get a few extra teachers to come along, and then, once he figured out how to do that consistently, he could figure out how to position everything perfectly so the USJ attack would result in 0 injuries. How difficult could it be to drag along a few extra teachers to a training exercise? Aizawa sat up in bed, scowling. Very difficult, apparently. He tried to bring extra teachers to protect the students 3 times now, but each time his attempts had failed in spectacularly unique ways. Aizawa approached Nezu directly and asked for an extra teacher or two to accompany the USJ trip. Then, Nezu asked why, and the conversation got really awkward because Aizawa didn't really plan an answer for that, so he just kept dodging the question. Eventually, Nezu just said that Aizawa could take whoever agreed to go with him, so Aizawa went around asking. Sure enough, every single teacher he talked to made some sort of excuse or said they had something else to do. Which, yeah, he wouldn't want to deal with 1A's first ever rescue training exercise either. First years tend to act rowdy and irresponsibly in the very beginning, usually irreverent and not understanding the gravity of hero work. But he wouldn't be asking for their help if it weren't important. Anyways, by the end of that loop, he managed to strong-arm Cementos into coming by steamrolling through all of his very obvious, polite, passive-aggressive signals that he didn't want to come. They went to the USJ together, and Aizawa was treated at the sight of the Nomu easily pounding Cementos into the floor, 13 being taken out again, and Midoriya snapping his arm like a twig. Great. To avoid the awkwardness of the previous loop, Aizawa quietly snuck into their classified files area, which contained the official teacher scheduling, to see who didn't have any work right now, resolving to walk up to them and announce to them that they'd been reassigned because they hadn't been working on anything else. Unfortunately, he was spotted, or sniffed out, by Hounddog, who assumed he was a villain infiltrator.
Why would a UA teacher be snooping around the files when he has the ability to access them normally?
Hounddog had said suspiciously, upon seeing him in the file room. So, Hounddog tackled him, restrained him, and brought him into an interrogation room. They'd called Sakachi, who was a few hours away, to question him, and by the time they'd cleared everything up and established that he was not a villain infiltrator, USJ had passed and Aizawa had been forced to start over. Aizawa was still a bit grumpy that Hounddog didn't apologize about that. The guy might have been planning to do it later, but since the loop reset, he'd probably never know. In his most recent loop, Aizawa called Endeavor. He had his number because the man was Todoroki's father, and let him know about a potential villain attack, asking him to come to the USJ at exactly the right time. Because the USJ was off campus, Endeavor would be able to walk right in. Well, normally he wouldn't, and security would lock him out, but at that specific time they'd been attacked, so the security system would be down. In that loop, Endeavor arrived near the beginning of the attack, but while Endeavor managed to defeat the Nomu with fire, barely, getting himself badly injured, he also managed to send a plume of fire towards the students, giving several severe burns. So, none of those worked. Still, Aizawa learned things from these loops. Primarily, he'd learned that there were several distinct problems that arose when he was trying to defeat the USJ perfectly. Problem number 1. The Nomu. It was extremely powerful and capable of regeneration. The number 1 and 2 heroes could fight it, but if All Might fought it, he would hurt himself. If Endeavor fought it, he'd accidentally hurt the students. In fact, Aizawa was pretty sure he'd never have a 0 injury rate if Endeavor was brought along. The first people he'd unintentionally injured had been when he'd blitzed recklessly through the entrance when Mineta and Shoji had been standing right there. It was something of a given that if Aizawa invited him along, he was going to accidentally toast a few people. Non-lethally, and everyone would have let it go after because of the dire situation, but decidedly unhelpful in this case. As for other ways to defeat the Nomu, fire had stopped the Nomu's regeneration, but Endeavor had come so close to losing that Aizawa wasn't sure that anyone with weaker flames than Endeavor could help him, and Endeavor was by far the strongest fire quirk user in the area. Aizawa briefly considered that some kind of mind control might be helpful, but when he looked up pro heroes with those kinds of quirks, there weren't any that lived close enough to get to the USJ in time. Desperate, he searched up UA students looking for a quirk like that, and he only found a kid whose quirk worked on people who answered his questions.
Since the Nomu never spoke, that was out.
There were other options, of course. Aizawa knew that All Might couldn't fight the Nomu normally without getting hurt, but maybe he could try to help him? He knew All Might had wasted his hero time on other things that morning. If he could force All Might to not use up any of his hero time, he'd arrive at the beginning of the USJ, and maybe he'd be able to defeat the Nomu without getting injured, which would completely solve the Nomu issue. If that didn't work, Aizawa could maybe look into trying to find people with niche quirks, like paralyze or body puppeteering, to stop the Nomu, but he got an odd sense that the Nomu would be immune to many things. Like it was a zombie, not a real person. Maybe it was the strange eyes and exposed brain that made him feel this way. Then there was problem number 2, 13. When Aizawa jumped in to take care of the rest of the villains, 13 always ended up inevitably accidentally injuring themselves against Kurogiri. This one might be easier to solve than the Nomu. If he brought another hero to help, or if All Might started out with them, maybe they would prevent 13 from getting injured. Or they could go fight the villains, and Aizawa himself could stop 13 from getting injured. Perhaps, even if Aizawa was fighting the villains in the center, Aizawa could whirl around and erase Kurogiri's quirk at just the right time to prevent the injury. That would take some great timing though, so Aizawa would have to keep a careful eye as to when 13 was using it in future loops if he wanted that to work. Problem number 3. Traumatic experiences don't disappear. Aizawa didn't want to think about this at first, but he'd been forced to put it on his problems list in the most recent loop. Midnight had pulled him aside and asked about what was going on between him and Hound Dog. Aizawa hadn't known what she'd meant at first, but soon enough he realized that he'd been instinctively avoiding Hound Dog because of what happened in the previous loop. Specifically, the way that Hound Dog tackled and arrested him, thinking he was an infiltrator for looking through classified files. Aizawa had tried to play it off, but from that point on, it was impossible to ignore how uncomfortable he felt when Hound Dog was standing behind him. If he was feeling mental after effects from something so small, it wasn't small, something inside him whispered. Violent arrests like that can be plenty traumatic. Then who was to say how bad things might, from a mental health perspective, get if he let himself get hurt repeatedly at the USJ? He had to be careful with that. Luckily, besides some minor burns from Endeavor, he managed to avoid most injury these past few loops. Now, having considered problem number 3, there was problem number 4. Midoriya. Midoriya got hurt. Always. Aizawa had tried doing the USJ, 4 times now? And every single time, Midoriya had managed to break some kind of bone. This was getting ridiculous. Aizawa was pretty sure he was going to expel the kid after the loop was over due to his repeated reckless quirk use. So, now, to plan the next loop. He was sick of awkward conversations with Nezu and the others about them coming along, so he decided to try something new. He would send out an SOS just as the group walked into the USJ, and by the time backup arrived, villains would be attacking. Perfect plan. Meanwhile, he'd keep an eye on 13 to figure out for later when was the best time to erase their quirk so they didn't accidentally injure themselves. That morning and afternoon, Aizawa lived as normally as possible, but tracked All Might's pre-USJ movements as much as he could, keeping an eye on the breaking news. He'd pinpointed the 3 locations that All Might had stopped major crimes at and diagrammed a rough estimate of his path. Hopefully, he could interrupt All Might in one of the future loops, and convince him to save his hero time so he'd be prepared for the USJ later. Once he memorized All Might's movements, he went to corral his students onto the bus. Aizawa texted Nezu that there was a villain attack on the USJ just as he and the students walked inside. Thank you for listening to Chapter 3 of the series. Please remember to go and leave some love on the original fic, and as always, I have links in my bio and my description for families in Palestine who really need help. I'm also going to leave a link for the Palestine Red Crescent Society, who are an amazing organization who provide humanitarian aid and raise awareness about the genocide happening in Palestine. They're a great organization, and any donations or other aid would be really beneficial. If you're able, please donate. People are dying, and the smallest amount of money is better than nothing. If you can't donate, please share the links, share their stories, because if we forget them, we're letting the people of Palestine die. Thank you for listening, have a lovely day, and don't forget about Palestine.